Hello, thank you for joining us for the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative Spring 2021 lecture series. The theme of this semester series is Democratic Processes and Spaces. This is the last lecture in the series for the semester. I'm Terry Schwartz, the director of the Cleveland Urban Design Collaborative. And on behalf of the College of Architecture and Environmental Design at Kent State, I just want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us today. We have a very special speaker today, and the architecture program director for Kent State, Yvonne Bernal, will introduce our speaker. So Yvonne.
Thank you, Terry, and welcome everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce Biko Mandela to the audience. Biko Mandela is an assistant professor of religion at Syracuse University. He writes, teaches, and thinks about the relationship between Blackness, religion, ethics, and philosophy in the United States. His first book, Black Lives Matter, is under contract with the Duke University Press. I first met Biko at Syracuse University when Linda Chang was doing a symposium, and I was fascinated by his ability to create a spatial picture of spaces that had gone under some kind of conflict, and how he was able to kind of like, through the way that he was presenting verbally, to create an image in my mind of that. And after that, we invited Vico to be part of the May 4 competition jury, and we had amazing conversations about how students were addressing those issues as well, social issues, racial issues, through the possibility of projecting a monument in Kent State. So I'm really happy that Vico's here, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me. I just want to say thanks again to everyone, to the CUDC, to Kent State, particularly to Yvonne. Yeah, Yvonne, I remember you when you were at Syracuse, and I had no clue what I was talking about, but Linda took a chance on this budding philosopher. And so it was just incredible. We are still working together. And I think with her, that's part of why I continue to foster this interest in space, and in this regard in architecture. With that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and get into my thoughts. Yvonne, if you can go ahead and share the screen, we'll start there. And I'll let you, as I said earlier, I'll let you know when to move to the next slide. The title of my talk is There's Always More in Store. The subtitle has shifted in large part because I'm not always interested in transformation of particular spaces. And so I will say more about that in the talk itself. But we're going to go ahead and get started because I'm probably more anxious to have conversations about the questions come than I am to hear myself speak. Okay, go ahead.
Can you see that?
I can see it perfectly. That's wonderful for me. So I won't be able to look directly at everyone, but I will definitely be, I'm reading right now, and then when I finish reading, we can have a conversation more generally. So we'll get started. As you can probably tell by my bio, I'm not an architect. I'm not a designer either. Novels and philosophy come quicker to me than computer-aided drafting and design programs and blueprints. To be in front of you then provides a bit of nervousness for me, because I know, and you do too, that I don't fit here. I'm aware of that. You're aware of that. We're aware of that. But if I were to be honest with myself, I'm not sure I fit anywhere. Not disciplinarily anyway. I'm a philosopher of religion by training, but the people I read, Descartes, Hegel, Heidegger, they would all shudder at my capacity to read them, let alone critique their thought. I don't even fit within the discipline that I was trained in. But I guess that's the point. I suspect I'm here because I'm not an architect, because my existence as a misfit being can be generative. It certainly is for philosophy or religion. And I suspect that it's possible for my thoughts to be generative in architecture and design. I don't fit. And maybe that's the point. I mean not to be heavy-handed. What I mean to say is that at the end of the day, architecture is about fit, about who fits and how, about where they fit and when. We design buildings and interiors with particular audiences and occupants in mind. Beyond the blueprints and design programs, beyond the structural analyses and building codes, architecture harnesses space meant to fit particular communities for particular purposes. Buildings provide a sense of place, a way of resting and finding refuge, even when you're working. Architecture then is about who fits and how, about where they fit and when. Along with Lewis Gordon, then, I might suggest that architecture is an aesthetic enterprise. Aesthetics, Gordon writes, is at the core of how human beings live in the world. You can go back, I haven't started transitioning yet. It is at the core of how human beings live in the world, not only in terms of lives worth living, but also in the value of those living it, unquote. To think with architecture, then, is to think about which lives are to be lived. And it's about where and how these lives are to be lived. A bust of Andrew Jackson tells me, beware. Columns in front of a home harkens back to plantation life. And yes, a campus can become a space of an outright violent skirmish. If you pay attention, a building will tell you if you fit. It will let you know if your life is worth living there. But my misfit existence turns all buildings into hostile spaces. The truth is that Blackness fits nowhere. We are made to disappear at the very moment we show ourselves. Fall asleep in a library, go for a run in a neighborhood and marvel at the architecture of the homes, or even be headed to what you thought was your home. All of this can be read as being in the wrong space. In the end, Blackness, Black lives, suffer. We die. Our suffering and death happen because we are out of place. Always. We know this. Others know this too. But we're still here. And despite what the world says, we must live. We do live until we are called to die. Sometimes that death happens in the street. Other times at a house. And in the time of this pandemic, we, Black people, are called to die in hospitals. Even spaces of so-called care are hostile to Black life. Blackness in space are not good bedfellows. But we still live, so we mutate space. The subtitle of this talk has transformation in it as one of the words, but I'm starting to think that transformation is too positive a term. What we do to space is neither permanent nor welcomed. And quiet as it's kept, Black people often do not shift the form of a space. What we do is improvise. We are improvisatory beings. We stay at places. I'm thinking about Black vernacular here. Most Black folks don't ask where you live, they ask where you stay. And so we stay at places. We don't make homes. We do not dwell. And this is a reference to Heidegger for those of you all who are familiar. Dwelling is something that lives worth living do. We are not afforded that luxury. If we stay too long, we'll overstay our welcome. In fact, we overstated the very moment we arrived. Our existence then, Black existence, is transient, it's fugitive, it's improvisatory. When we arrive at a place, we inhabit it, but we know that this inhabitation is an uncomfortable one, and it's temporary. When we build, as in build buildings, we know that the space doesn't remain. It isn't meant to. Even our memorials don't remain. And I'm thinking here of Michael Brown's memorial. When he died, people put a memorial in the middle of the street or on the side of the street, and it was burned down, stolen, taken away. Our memorials are fabricated from stuffed animals, flowers, candles, and paper cards. They are impermanent. People can and will destroy and remove them. Our memorials then are not designed. They are improvised. This talk then is about the mutation of space. You can go to the next slide. It's about how this mutation is sacred. And in order to do this, I want to turn to the Triple S mark in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. The day was July 5th, 2016, and it was Alton Sterling's last day alive. If you remember Sterling at all, chances are you remember the shots. There were 6 of them, 3 from up close. They were belly to belly, as Officer Blaine Salamone described it, and then another 3 in the back. As Sterling rolled over and died, as he transitioned from living flesh to dead corpse, those who witnessed the death were made to remember just that, the death. They remember, or were made to remember, the shots. But there are other things to remember. Memory, after all, is not objective. It is a matter of attention, of recollection. It pays attention to specific things. It offers glimpses of the past, not its totality. And these partial glimpses are focused on who and what is important. History is the record of lives worth living. But when it comes to Blackness, history records us as dead or about to die. We are numbers on a ledger. We are victims of violence. We show up in the moment of our deaths. That's how it goes, I guess. The world then is made to remember the shots. In being made to recall these shots, we are also made to recall a discourse about Blackness, about Black life. We are made to think about Black life as nothing more than Black death. Remembering in this way, and this is why I have this image, I want to just take a brief side. This is why I have this image of Alton Sterling here smiling. Because part of it is that we are made to remember him laying on the ground, and we'll see this in a second. Remembering in this way reproduces this death. It prompts us to keep thinking of Blackness as deathly and deadly, and so it reproduces Blackness as death. If Blackness is nothing more than death, if Blackness is nothing but death, then Black people are always and already made to die. So when we remember Alton Sterling, we remember the shots and we await more. But if we pay close attention, we might see other things. We might find those 1,001 little actions that make up a life, quote unquote, as Ronald Judy, quoting W.B. Du Bois, once stated. If we look at the videos of Sterling's killing closely, then we might catch glimpses of that life. We might, as you see in this particular image, we might see the table with CDs. If we pay attention to that table, we might remember that Alton Sterling was dubbed the Music Man. We can remember that he loved music and that he loved sharing it. We might recognize that Sterling was moving until he wasn't. And I won't show the video. This is the closest you're going to get to what the actual video is. If you want to watch it, you will notice that Sterling is always moving in his encounter with these two officers. And so we might recognize that Sterling was moving until he wasn't. We might focus on that movement and notice that, again, Sterling was living. And perhaps most important for our time here, and you can see it in this image, most important for our time here, we might remember that all of this happened in front of a convenience store, in a parking lot. In remembering this, we might also remember then how Sterling made a connection with the store's owner and how they made a deal for him to sell CDs out front. We might recognize then that Sterling set up a music store in front of a convenience store. He set up a storefront store. He mutated space. In remembering these things, the music table, the movement, the storefront store, we are alerted to the fact that Sterling mutated that storefront into a gathering place. And in remembering Sterling's mutation, we are alerted to the fact that Black life has often been engaged in mutating space, storefront space. And so in remembering Sterling, we might be able to remember that Black people have often mutated storefront space to the point where they worshiped in them. You can go to the next slide. When we think of Black churches, this is what I'm talking about, worshiping in these spaces. When we think of Black churches, we typically think of this axiomatic institution called, quote unquote, the Black church. Martin Luther King Jr. and Ralph Abernathy, who were up at the top left, and Jesse Jackson as well, come to mind. And in contemporary times, people like T.D. Jakes comes to mind too. And at the bottom right is Polly Murray, who was a Black Episcopal priest. She was also queer. We envision masses of Black people, usually women, sitting in pews, listening to gospel choirs who have the most heavenly of voices. When we think of the Black church, we think of the music greats, Whitney Houston and Aretha Franklin, whose anniversary of her death, I believe, just happened. Jasmine Sullivan, who, and we're not going to go into this when we talk about music greats. If you disagree that Jasmine Sullivan is not one of the greatest singers of all time, that's the end. We don't have anything else to talk about because she's fantastic. And Beyonce. And we remember that these women, these greats, these singing greats, began their careers singing in choirs. But we rarely think about, and we're going to stay here for a while, Yvonne, on this slide, but we rarely think about the spaces in which these possibilities emerged. We miss how churches are mutations of space, how Black people were relegated to the balconies of worship spaces in 1816, and how, in turn, they found other spaces where the sacred could be cultivated, even if it wasn't encouraged. For those who know this history, what I'm about to say won't be new. But for others, I think it's worth the refresher. Now we can move to the next slide. Consider, for example, the hush harbors. During the 19th century, white people made a significant push to quote unquote Christianize their slaves. And in doing, they gave them a bastardized version of the Gospels. Slaves, obey your masters, they preached. And they preached this gospel in the name of quote unquote saving Black souls without actually saving Black lives or freeing Black lives. But these teachings of saving Black souls, of slaves obey your masters, the teachings didn't always stick. While enslaved Black folks might have been forced to attend these sermons, they also knew that there were other possibilities. So in the middle of the night, perhaps on Sunday, they would steal away to the woods, develop ways to insulate the sound, and sing, dance, and commune with one another and their God. Scholars, and we're going to stay here for a while, Yvonne, too. I just want to let you know. Scholars do not know what these hush harbors looked like, but we do know they existed. And this image here is a sort of artistic depiction of what they could have looked like. If you can see, they're in the middle of the woods, mutating this space to cultivate communion with the sacred. Scholars do not know what they look like, but we do know they existed. And they weren't buildings, they were clearings, spaces in the woods where enslaved Black people could find community and respite from the violence of anti-Black chattel slavery. These spaces were outside. The sacred happened within the trees. No crosses, no pulpits, no choir robes, no pews. Just people in a clearing, in a space, a mutated space, communing with one another and their God. But while God probably figured heavily in the hush harbors, I want to be clear here. I'm not actually interested in theology. If you want to talk about in the Q&A, we can do so. But for now, I'm interested in how the woods itself, the woods themselves, became sacred. I think a lot about this passage from Beloved, and you're going to get quite a bit of literature in this talk. I think a lot about this passage from Toni Morrison's Beloved, where a preacher, a Black woman named Baby Shug, says the following words in a clearing not unlike the one you see on your screen. She says this: "Here, in this here place, we flesh that weeps and laughs, flesh that dances on bare feet in grass. Love it hard." If we pay close attention, we'll see that the quote unquote we, as in we flesh, is the community's identity. The we is not a collection of individuals. It is instead a social subject, a singularity, irreducible to either collectivity or individuality. The we in we flesh is not a collection of people, and it is also not an individual in the sense of a single subject. This social subject is made possible by moving flesh, Black moving flesh. And this is what I mean by the sacred. The sacred is, in this case, a transformation of one person into the we, where one's existence, always and already, is folded into the social. Individualism cannot stand here. All that is here, all that can be tolerated here, is a we, as in we flesh. Though we do not know what happened in the hush harbors, I want to suggest that this eruption of a we out in the woods was part of their gathering spaces. And as such, the hush harbor is one of the first moments in a genealogy of Black sacred space mutation. It is sacred because it is social, and it is mutation because the woods were not meant for such an engagement. Those Black folks didn't fit out there either. And had they been caught, had they been found out, they too would have suffered and died, but they did it anyway. This trend didn't end with hush harbors, and it certainly didn't end with slavery. Although Black denominations would emerge in the mid to late 18th century, they would develop more in the early 19th century and establish themselves as premier spaces for Black people to gather. After emancipation, these churches would gain strength and prominence. They would become premier sites for social uplift and political engagement. But post-emancipation wasn't all it was cracked up to be. Okay, here we are. As Saidiya Hartman observes, Black subjection was still rampant, and many Black people found themselves wanting to move north. So they did. Black people were transient. They improvised. They spread out. They went different places. You can move to the next slide, Yvonne. This isn't to say that Black people didn't make it. In fact, many of the Black churches, particularly in Chicago, found ways to move economically upward. And if you can see in these images, just look at how fly these folks are with the blue suits and the 3 feet tall hats. They are winning. And this is an establishment of their middle class sensibilities. As gorgeous as these folks are, as done up as they are, this is an establishment of their middle class sensibilities. And so once they moved upward, they would build quote unquote standard churches. Look in the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. Churches with pews and a pulpit and perhaps a baptismal pool. People like Reverend E.C. Ransom in Chicago would build gyms and educational centers. These churches would become, as their predecessors, places where Black people could live and thrive and gather. But these churches weren't for everyone. They were riffs off of white sacred spaces. They had their pews and their choirs with their robes and their preachers. And while this worked for a lot of upwardly mobile Black folks, there were other Black folks who still didn't fit. These churches that you see, as you can see in these images, required a certain kind of dress and a certain kind of behavior. Quote, the main reason I haven't been to church, quote, one person commented, is because I don't have sufficient clothes to wear, unquote. Class became a barrier to entry for these more established churches. There were many who did not fit. There were other reasons why traditional Black churches didn't suffice for many people too. The style of worship, for example, had become, again, like their white counterparts, stale and static. The services lacked that ecstasy, that frenzy, as Du Bois once called it, that for many people marked the sacred. So for these Black folks who didn't fit, unable to dress the part or uninterested in, well, boring forms of worship, they ended up looking elsewhere. We can go to the next slide. Enter storefront churches. Although, quote, storefront churches have ever since been sources of embarrassment for middle-class religionists, unquote, as Herbert Collins observes, there was something about storefronts that allowed for something different. I'll let Collins take it from here. The resiliency of storefronts suggests that their roots in Christian sectarianism and their responsiveness to status deprivation constitute something more substantial than their seedy and marginal facades would indicate, or than their tractors would concede. I want us to stop here and look at the front of these churches. Look at these 2 images, these 3 images to your right. These things are buried, nestled in the middle of plazas. And these are the seedy and marginal facades that Herbert Collins is talking about. These places shouldn't be here. Storefront churches were mutated spaces. They were once places of commerce. That's what they were built for. But much like Sterling's mutation of that parking lot in front of the Triple S Mart, those who didn't fit mutated these spaces into places of and for the sacred. Many storefront congregations did not own leases to these spaces. Much of my research into Black churches noted that when people were moving up north, they would inhabit these storefronts without a lease. And I want you all to keep that in mind. Without a lease, they did not own or have rights to the space. And it was precisely in this lack of ownership, in this squatting, in this refusal to adhere to the rules of property, that Black life, Black flesh, moving, dancing, shouting, singing Black flesh could be loved. Yes, as you can see on your right, the buildings were in disrepute. And yes, they were small. If you look to the left, you'll see what I'm talking about. There were no baptismal pools or Sunday school rooms. And sometimes there might not have even been lights. Keep in mind, some folks couldn't afford the lease. They didn't pay for these spaces. With chairs instead of pews, with cold, dusty floors, and perhaps no microphone for the preacher, with no choir robes or fancy communion plates, these spaces became places, sacred places, for Black people to make sense of who and what they were in community, in sociality. We flesh. I want us to consider what it means for a dilapidated, broken down, abandoned building with a seedy and marginal facade to become a sacred space. This isn't renovation. This is not House Hunters or HGTV or Love It or Listed. This isn't renovation. There was no money to paint the walls or secure plumbing. There were no designs put in place. And yet these places, deemed uninhabitable by nearly everyone, became the place of what we might call the supra-inhabitation of the sacred. Something else, something otherwise, something more happened and was housed in the storefronts, which is to say, these storefronts always had something more in store. And then we're about to start landing this plane. It might be unintuitive to turn to literature to discuss architecture, but I've already introduced it with Beloved, so we're gonna ride this car all the way down. After all, many novels do not carry images. There aren't many ways to think about space. But I think it might work here, so I want to turn to two novels to make my point. The first is James Baldwin's Go Tell It on the Mountain. I do not have time to recount the whole story here, but to suffice it to say, it's about a young man named John Grimes, a Black queer boy in New York City, who is struggling with his identity. His family is deeply religious. His abusive father, who turns out to be his stepfather, is a deacon in the storefront church that they regularly attend. And toward the end of the novel, John has an experience in that storefront. And you can move to the next slide. Because we're with each other, I want you all to be able to follow along as I read these quotes. I'm not simply block quoting because the writing is beautiful, but as I'll say in a bit, it's because I want us to pay attention to certain details in these paragraphs. And so John has an experience in the storefront. He knew, without knowing how it happened, that he lay on the floor in the dusty space before the altar, and knew that above him burned the yellow light, which he had himself switched on. Dust was in his nostrils, sharp and terrible, and the feet of the saints, shaking the floor beneath him, raised small clouds of dust that filmed his mouth. Pay attention to the details, to the phenomenology, the dusty floor and the yellow light, the shaking feet of the saints. Baldwin is signaling to us the utter everydayness of this space, the quotidian nature of this storefront. And yet the dust, the lights, and the feet conditioned John's conversion. They were the space in which something else, something other, something more would move him. You can move to the next slide. And something moved in John's body, which was not John. He was invaded, set at naught, possessed. This power had struck John in the head or in the heart. It had cracked him open as wood beneath the axe cracks down the middle, as rocks break up. He wanted to rise. A malicious, ironic voice insisted that he rise, and at once to leave this temple and go out into the world. This all feels supernatural, and it should. This is what St. John of the Cross might call a, quote, dark night of the soul. And it should definitely feel this way because Baldwin knew what he was doing as a writer. But do not lose sight of the space, of the dust, the feet of the saints, the yellow lights. Don't lose sight of where and how this experience happens, how saints dancing and shouting, how yellow lights and dusty floors choke John up and condition his terrifying conversion experience. This is happening in a storefront. And what is happening, you ask? Nothing less than what Anthony Penn, religion scholar Anthony Penn, calls a, quote, wrestling with history, unquote, an existential reckoning with the meaning of John's being. This is a conversion experience, yes, but it is also a struggle to understand the meaning of Black existence. You can go to the next slide. The ironic voice demanded of John scornfully if he believed that he was cursed. All niggas had been cursed, the ironic voice reminded him. All niggas had come from the most undutiful of Noah's sons. Could a curse come down so many ages? As John's experience confirms, storefront churches can provide a descent into sociality, into communion with others, past and present. He is with his ancestors, with people who were in the ships, in the hold, in the Middle Passage. And this experience can be brutal. John was reminded of his Blackness on the dusty floor of his church, of his wretched and cursed condition. This space, this storefront, this mutated storefront space conditions a descent into an existential struggle, but it also conditions an ascent into something like life. As John is writhing on the floor, struggling, he sees something. You can go to the next slide. He had turned again to kneel at the altar and had faced the golden cross that was there on the altar. And the Holy Ghost was speaking, seeming to say, as John spelled out the so abruptly present and gigantic legend adorning the cross, Jesus saves. You can move to the next slide. The dust chokes, the lights blind, the feet rumble, and the cross helps John find his way. And what I want to underscore here is that this shouldn't have happened. John shouldn't be here. The congregation shouldn't be here, because this is a storefront, a place meant for the movement of commerce, the buying and selling of goods. And yet here they are. Here John is enraptured in a terrifyingly sacred experience. This is a moment of release, a moment of connection, a sacred moment. And we're going to stay here for a while, Yvonne. We're going to be on this slide for a little while. Do not mistake me here. John's conversion experience doesn't stem the tide of anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness remains. It doesn't end, but that release is meaningful. I've got one more example for you before I close. It comes from Nella Larson's Quicksand. While John's release might be read as hopeful, if you know the end of the novel, that it has a more hopeful ending to Go Tell It on the Mountain. Helga Crane, the protagonist of Quicksand, does not get a happy ending. For her whole life, Crane had been looking for something secure. She was mixed, and her mixed race status made her feel as if she didn't fit anywhere, literally anywhere. She traveled the world and could not find refuge. And so toward the end of the novel, after having heartbreak, Helga Crane drinks herself to sleep. And on the next day, she walks out into a rainy street looking for something. And what she found was singing in a storefront church. She had opened the door and entered before she was aware that inside people were singing a song which she was conscious of having heard years ago. Hundreds of years, it seemed. As this music grew, so did something within Helga. These people had made this storefront space into something else. They were stamping their feet. They were clapping their hands. The music had gotten louder and faster, and it was shifting the atmosphere. Helga cried. She wept. This was too much. It was overwhelming, but it was doing something. You can move to the next slide, Yvonne. As Helga watched and listened, gradually a curious influence penetrated her. She felt the echo of the weird orgy resound in her heart. She felt herself possessed by the same madness. She too felt a brutal desire to shout and to sling herself about. She fell against the crude railing which enclosed the little platform. For a single moment, she remained there in silent stillness because she was afraid she was going to be sick. And in that moment, she was lost or saved. I want us again to pay attention to the space. This is why I keep putting these quotes up here, to how the quote unquote crude railing promotes a sense of disorientation that eventually translates into either perdition or salvation. And the perdition is important here. The being lost is important here. The mutation of space, even into sacred space, is not always pleasant. Quicksand does not have a happy ending, and no, I won't give it away. But the sacred can provide solace, but that solace is and probably always will be temporary. By the end of the novel, Helga is not doing well. But that experience in the storefront was a sacred one. Like John, Helga was possessed by the sacred. That railing, that comes with the singing, that railing disoriented her. She couldn't tell if she was lost or saved. That space did and undid her. And it was about the community as well as the space itself, just like it was with John. And here's where we're starting to wrap up. If you feel as if I've left the realm of architecture by turning to Helga Crane in Quicksand and John Grimes in Go Tell It on the Mountain, here's my point. I turned to storefront churches to show that Black architecture, if such a thing exists, is not about building codes. It's not about design. It doesn't always have blueprints. It isn't always formed from computer programs. Black architecture, again, if such a thing is real, and this is my point, Black architecture persists in its capacity to undo space. Black architecture persists in its capacity to undo space, to upset the preoccupation with fit that, at least from my humble perspective, dominates quite a bit of architectural studies. This isn't, again, as I say before, this isn't house flipping or renovation. That, again, would be about fit. As I said before, or as I said earlier, many of the congregations who occupied storefronts did not and could not pay the bills. They did not own leases to the buildings they occupied. They were squatters. They weren't meant to be there. And they worshiped at their own risk. They didn't fit in these spaces. They couldn't afford to fit in these spaces. But if the Black literary tradition, a la James Baldwin and Nella Larson, is any indication, Blackness need not fit to inhabit a space. It will improvise, it will move, and in moving, it will mutate space. It will undo it. As I conclude, you can move to the next slide. As I conclude, I would like to return to Alton Sterling and the Triple S Mart. I said at the beginning of this talk that we were made to remember the shots, that we are made to remember Sterling as only one who died. Sterling becomes hashtag Alton Sterling, another name amongst many that the state has discarded. But remember the table. Remember the car, remember the movement, and remember the location. And you can see the table right there in the earlier part of that gift. Sterling was the music man, sharing music with others in front of the store, not unlike the experience Helga had with the singing she heard from the storefront church. He worked outside, on the ground, beneath fluorescent lighting, not unlike the lighting John Grimes experienced in his conversion experience in the church. If we remember the table, the movement, the storefront, and the storefront store, we begin to realize that even though Sterling didn't fit, he undid that parking lot. He mutated that space into a place where sound moved people, where music could be heard, where the sounds of life, Black life, could flourish and resonate. That's also part of Sterling's legacy. His capacity to move people through his sharing of music, his capacity to undo space by mutating it. Setting up a storefront store, Sterling reminded us that there was more to his legacy than the 6 bullets that ended his life. Like John and Helga, Alton Sterling reminds us that when it comes to Black life in space, there's always more in store. In the wake of his death, others have transformed the physical space. They made a memorial where he used to sell CDs, and you see that at the end of the gift. They turned that storefront into something more. They allowed the storefront to prompt reflection and to allow others to not simply see the violence, but also the life, the movement, the sociality that Sterling enacted and engendered. That parking lot may not be a church. There may be no choirs or altars. But if you listen closely, perhaps you can still hear the music. And in hearing the music, maybe you'll realize that even though we don't fit, our lives are always, always worth living. Thank you.
Thank you, Rico. That was amazing. Terry, Gillian, are you gonna moderate the Q&A? Correct.
So I'm yours. You're muted, I think.
Terry, you're muted.
Sorry, I always do that. Thank you. That was remarkable. We have a question to start from Marcia Milazzo, who asks, novels constitute an important archive in your work, including in this talk. What is at stake for you in turning to fiction to reflect upon Black life and the spaces that Black people inhabit and transform in particular?
Oh man, Marcia, it's good to see you / hear from you. I would say it's difficult. I think that I first started getting into reading fiction, reading novels, because these characters became very real to me. And the more that I read these novels, the more that I sat with Baby Suggs, the more that I sat with John Grimes, I started to realize that one of the main reasons we turn to fiction is because it has a lot to say about our realities. And so what's at stake for me is, in a certain way, blending or blurring the lines between what constitutes the real and what constitutes the fictional. Because in my mind, anyway, Black people constantly live in this space of non-existence anyway. And so to turn to fiction in a certain way is also to turn to Black life more generally, because the fact that we live, as Lewis Gordon points out, he says that we constitute illicit appearance. We actually shouldn't be here because our suffering causes the system problems. And so for me, our illicit appearance, the fact that we shouldn't be here, the fact that we actually kind of shouldn't exist, actually dovetails quite well with reading novels, because these characters don't exist. And so, or they don't exist in any empirical way anyway. And yet they resonate so deeply. Morrison was a Nobel laureate, you already know this. Helga Crane was one of the most powerful writers of the Harlem Renaissance, and James Baldwin, he needs no introduction. And so I think in a certain way, all of the things that I'm reading is my attempt to try to sit with what I understand as the putative non-existence of Blackness, as nonetheless having profound impacts in this empirical world in which we live. And you know as well as I do that doesn't mean that I have some hopeful, or I have some sort of like naive hope in the fact that things can get better. If that were the case, neither George Floyd nor Breonna Taylor would have been killed. And if you read Toni Morrison's novels, none of her novels end on happy endings. And so I think in a very real way, what I'm trying to do with novels, and particularly as it relates to space, what I'm trying to do is to note that we're doing things to space that don't get registered on the first part. And at the same time, we're also doing things that call into question what constitutes legitimate appearance, what constitutes reality. What does it mean that these folks who moved north to deal with these Black churches, to try to inhabit spaces that were uninhabitable, what does it mean that many of them did not have leases, that they really were squatting there? What does it mean that for those who did have leases, that that these places were deemed illegitimate by folks who had a more normative conception of religion and religiosity? What does it mean that at the end of the day, these storefronts weren't supposed to be used for sacred spaces? They were supposed to be a place where commerce happened. And so these impacts are happening, and that transfer, I guess we can call it transformation, but that mutation, that undoing of the normative conception of those spaces is what I see often happening in Black fiction, in Black novels.
Thank you. I wonder if you see a path or a value in a path from mutation to permanence. I mean, is that something to aspire to? I think about in Cleveland, there are a lot of storefront churches, one that I've been watching for many years that started as one storefront that has a very distinctive red color in the facade and the signage. And it went from being a single storefront as a space of worship Well, then the next space to it became kind of part of it. It's a daycare center.
Mhm.
And then, kind of the parking lot became incorporated into it. And at this point, it's block long and it
Mhm.
feels like a campus. Um,
Yes.
in part because of the use of that color that repeats, and you can sort of see it as an entity. I don't know if that qualifies as permanent, but I'm sort of curious about the way that you've kind of um, been describing the mutation and the transformation, about whether, kind of having something fixed and permanent would be something to aspire to, or is it the meaning in the mutation, if you know what I mean?
I see what you're saying. I would say that much of the historical work on Black churches, particularly in Chicago, I believe his name is St. Clair Drake, who did a study on Black institutions in Chicago right around the time of the Great Migration. And so much of what you're pointing out is in many ways the same thing that he noticed when he was looking at these storefront churches, which is many of them did search for permanence. Many of them tried to grow, and some of them ended up doing it. And I think in a certain way, I think that yearning for permanence, it makes sense to me. It definitely does. I don't disagree with the sentiment, but I also think that once that happens, there's a certain kind of normativity that creeps in that ends up undoing some of the quite frankly the sort of like inadvertent like mutation that happens in these spaces when they're first starting out. And I think I do think, I won't say there's meaning in the mutation so much as I would say that this is what happens when Blackness touches a space, is that the thing, it doesn't change in the sense of like, oh, it's better. It deforms, it disfigures, it turns upside down and inside out. And I think that maybe meaning is probably too strong of a term, but I think that that's probably the closest term we're going to get, I think, to what I'm trying to point out here in mutation, that there's something generative there when it is improvised, when it is mutated, when it is undone and unworked. There's something there that allows for the eruption of something otherwise, as a Black studies scholar, Sean probably might say. So yes, I think it's possible, and I think it has happened multiple times, as you're pointing out, that permanence occurs. And I think, or something like more stability occurs. But then I would wonder, well, what happens to the institution as such when that kind of thing occurs? I wonder if the dress starts to change, for example. I wonder if people start getting robes. I wonder if people start looking more and more like traditional churches, and therefore become a reflection of normative society. So those are my questions. I don't know if that answered it at all. But
Well, it actually raised another, the other thing we see in Cleveland, in addition to sort of the long-standing storefront churches
yes,
expanding, is that we also see Black congregations moving into buildings that were formerly occupied
yes,
by Jewish congregations. So synagogues transformed, or Catholic churches, which the building themselves are designed to be, kind of substantial and permanent. It's the transformation comes in the way that it's inhabited and the way people use it. I mean, do you have a similar reaction to that, in the sense that if it becomes a more permanent building, it makes it more normative and it begins to exclude a certain kind of, I don't know what I'm asking.
it's so fascinating to me. I used to attend, this is probably too personal, but I used to attend it when I was in div school. In order to get a PhD in religious studies, you have to get like a master's in religion. You can either do that at a PhD program, or you could do it at what we call like divinity schools. And so I went to a divinity school, and I went to this church that was essentially a remade Methodist church, except it wasn't remade. We just occupied the space. And so there was a kneeling altar at the front. And I think you might be onto something, that what happens is in part because of the people. That's what I'm trying to talk about in terms of the sacred dimension of this, is that it is sacred because we show up and we show out, and we undo some of the normative conceptions of this space. Like I can imagine, I don't know. I don't know of any examples off the top of my head of Black people occupying, for example, a Catholic space, right? But you have those kneelers. If you've ever been to a Catholic church, you have those kneelers in the pews, and we don't kneel when we go to church, right? We don't I mean, we don't kneel in that way. I mean, unless we're Catholic, and then we do. But I think in a certain way, we don't make those kinds of, that architecture is not built for the ecstatic kind of worship that occurs within the context of many of these more charismatic movements, charismatic modalities of engagement. I come from a Kojic background, which is just Black Pentecostalism. And so we have no use for kneelers. but we would occupy that space if we had the money, and I'm sure we'd still have a blast in that. So I think you're absolutely right to point out that this can occur within these normative spaces, but then there's a disfiguration of the normative liturgics that happen in that space. And in that regard, that's an undoing of the normative purpose of that space. I don't know much about synagogues, so I'm going to leave that one alone, because I don't know much about the architecture of synagogues. But I do know, in terms of particularly Christian institutions, if we think about Catholic spaces or even Methodist spaces, some of these kneelers that are happening, this actually runs our worship, or not even ours, certain forms of worship run counter to the normative conceptions of that space itself. Does that help? I feel like I'm like not answering your question, but I think I'm
great, Biko. Biko, and alongside of this, I had a quick question, which is if you've noticed a similar thing happening in the African American Muslim tradition. I have seen storefront mosque in New York City and other places, and I'm wondering if you've taken a look at that.
I would say that I haven't taken a look at specifically like Black, like Sunni Muslims, but the Nation of Islam is part of my research a little bit, and we see the storefront, they call them temples, but we see the storefront temples occupying spaces in that way too, and I think that's what I'm trying to get at when I say maybe Black architecture undoes space. That there's a certain way that, like, when we move in or when we inhabit, I can't say move in because we never know how long we're going to be there, but when we inhabit a space, there is a kind of upturning of the normative conception of what these buildings were meant to do. And this happens in the Nation of Islam quite often. They will buy storefront spaces, and next thing you know, you've got the women on the right side with the white clothing on, you've got the men over here on the left side, or I think it's flipped, women on the left, women on the right. And so you have this kind of unworking of the normative conception of these spaces. Now, if Nation of Islam, if they occupy mosques, I don't know how far to go, except to say that for many Sunni Muslims, the Nation of Islam is not at all Muslim at all. And so their very presence as occupying this space becomes a disfiguration of what this space was meant to have. And so I guess what I'm trying to get at in all of this, now that you all are asking these wonderful questions, what I'm trying to get at here is that when I think about architecture, when I think about space, I'm thinking about the unworking of the normativity that's built into some of these spaces as they are designed. And I'm not saying Black people are the only folks who do this, but I am noticing, at least in terms of Black churches and with the Nation of Islam, I'm noticing that we don't go in. That's why I like made the quip about like HGTV, although I love HGTV, not gonna lie about it, but like that's why I made the quip about that it's not that this isn't like, you know, I don't know, Property Brothers or like, you know, Love It or this isn't that, because many times these folks don't come in and put paint on the walls. They can't afford to do that. They don't get to come in and like redesign the interior structure. There is no iPad presentation of how much the budget is going to cost, and none of that. You go in there, if you got a couple of chairs, perhaps you've got a microphone and a makeshift stand, and that's it. And the space looks pretty much unchanged, which is why in the novel, John keeps talking about, or Baldwin keeps talking about this dust and Go Tell It on the Mountain, because he can't get the dust up. It's too much. And he swept the floors, but this space is not, it hasn't been redone. It's been undone. And so I'm trying to get to that part. Does that help? I'm passionate because I'm excited. So don't take it as like, oh, I'm like angry. It's really like, I'm just like, really just excited about this.
Not at all. And we have a couple of questions. Is it okay if I ask? I'm gonna package 3 questions, and one is from me, and I'm really interested in the question around ownership. Yes. Around this set of issues, and if you have seen, and if you ever thought about what this new ownership model might look like, and like if these processes were to be recognized and amplified as the ones that might be appropriate, what kind of other ownership models by questioning the traditional one are these pointing towards?
Mm-hmm.
But then I'm going to ask you quickly. Kristen Sieber, a colleague here at the CUDC, asked, thanks, because this was amazing. I really appreciated your documentation of the importance and sacredness of informal and even illegal spaces. But often these are the spaces that cities look to remove and regulate away. How do you think those making decisions in our cities can support these informal spaces, even in redeveloping neighborhoods? Caitlin Boniecki, who's a graduate student in the MARC and MUD programs, asked, the use of narration and storytelling seem key in addressing some of the injustices architecture has perpetuated for centuries. In what ways can designers promote the use of fiction, oration, transformation, and inclusion in their work? What efforts have you seen that were successful? And I'll leave it at that. It's not packaged too many.
No, well, so I'll start with this first question of ownership. I think that if you want my sort of like honest, the philosophical, like ethical response, it is the undoing of ownership itself. Ronaldo Walcott has a book. He's a Black Studies scholar in Canada, and he just wrote a book called On Property. And his argument is that at some point in time, this notion of property is disastrous, particularly for Black folks, but for many marginalized populations across the West. And I think he's right about this. I haven't had a chance. The book is like fresh out, so I haven't had a chance to read. I just read the introduction, and his point though was, at least in the intro, is that there's a particular way in which the carving out of space and the carving out of an own space, what it ends up doing is it ends up siphoning off and producing certain kinds of, and this is my riff off of him, this is not him. What it ends up doing, as I read him, is it ends up producing a certain kind of subject that requires a certain kind of property, and therefore pushes for a certain kind of expansion that we think of as the thing is building out, but it's actually a certain kind of like internalized colonialism. And this is my way of suggesting that like part of owning spaces is the desire to like carve out this niche for yourself and to say that no one else can have access to it. And so my ethical response is we have to do away with property as a conception altogether. But in the meantime, I think there is a way. I think the sort of like, I guess, step toward that is something like collective economics. It's something like no one person, no one entity has control over the stakes of this particular building site, whatever the case may be. And no one person is controlling how this stuff works, but it is a truly, in reference to this series, a democratic process in which the interests of the space are shared, and therefore the future of the space relies upon the sociality of the community itself. In that regard, when I think about Kristen's question, hopefully this will help to segue to that. When I think about Kristen's question, I think one of the big things that many cities have to think about is this question of gentrification. What does it mean to redevelop a neighborhood? Well, unfortunately, it has too often meant the displacement of particular communities in the name of something far more better, or whatever the case may be. And what would it mean for many communities, many cities, to devote their interest, to devote their resources, to devote whatever it is they have to not redeveloping spaces, but cultivating those spaces such that people who are already there can thrive even more than they already have, such that the mutation of space, to borrow, might actually become more permanent, right? And so I think that's something that could be possible. And so that's what I think in terms of I don't know if that's an actual answer in terms of like how, but I think so many cities are so corporate driven. I'm currently in Houston, and this is what they do. They give tax write-offs to large corporations, and the next thing we know, a whole Black neighborhood's gone because the cops have removed everybody and a new high-rise is showing up. Part of that happens because these city governments are doing this kind of work. And I think a certain way is to stave that off, to say, no, this is going to cost more and it's going to be a problem in terms of our economics, but those people will have the capacity to thrive even more. And so I think hopefully, and Kristen, feel free to say if I've elaborated, if I've responded to your question appropriately. Caitlin, I don't even know how to answer your question, not because it's a bad question, but because it is such a profound one. I'll give you an example, and Yvonne knows a bit about this. I'll give you a brief example of this, just in terms of what I did with Linda Zhang. We decided to look at Canfield Drive, the site where Michael Brown was killed. And we told the students, as we were working with them in this class, we said, We know, or I have a hunch that Michael Brown should not have been, okay, I'll see you later. I'll be quick here. We know that Michael Brown was probably was not supposed to die. He was not supposed to be killed. And yet at the same time, the country's hung up on whether or not Michael Brown was a criminal, and therefore whether or not Darren Wilson is a hero. And what we produced in response to that is a set of tiles that look nothing like the site, but informally like index the site itself. And so I suggest this to say that perhaps what designers might be able to do is to draw from these stories in order to unwork some of the normative commitments that we have been wedded to. And this is hard to do. And that's why I say I don't really know how to answer that question, except to say, maybe we read these stories to try and unwork some of our normative commitments. And so that's the way I would respond to Caitlin's question. I think we have one more, or if we're over time, I totally get it.
Why don't we do one more? Some of our audience may have to jump off because our students are going into a review. Actually, that's where Killian went. He said goodbye. Sorry about that. Let's do this one from Katie Slusher. I'm interested in your use of the words transform and mutate. Seems like transformation is used to describe something elevating or connoting an improvement, while mutation may feel more negative. Maybe I just feel that way after reading too many articles about COVID mutations. What do you hear in those two words? And when are you drawn to use one versus the other?
I hear the same exact things that you hear, Katie. There's no way around it. I'm absolutely hearing the same positive uplift. And there's a reason why I'm using the word mutation in relation to what Black people do. Because mutation, it is an inverse and an upturning, again, an undoing of certain normative logics in our head. And so, yes, when I say mutate, I do mean something like feeling more negative, because these spaces weren't meant for us to be there. And so then when if we show up in the Hush Harbor, if we show up in a storefront, it is perceived as problematic. It is perceived as us being out of place. We think about Ahmaud Arbery, for example. He's running throughout a street, and I mean, the house is open to everyone, and yet he gets there and two people kill him. They kill him because he's not supposed to be there, because he mutated the space. And, I mean, the irony, of course, is the correlation between Blackness and COVID. And I think in a certain way, I cannot, I do work in Black studies. What we do not shy away from, Fred Moten has an article called The Case of Blackness. What we do not shy away from is the pathologization of Blackness. But our suggestion is that if we are pathological, if we are the problem, then the problem is precisely where the possibilities are. The normative conceptions are the ones that overdetermine the meaning of being. And so for us, or at least for me, I won't even speak for anyone else. For me, I'm thinking particularly with Toni Morrison, who wrote a book called The Bluest Eye, her very first book. She wrote that text and she said at the end that everybody else who thought there was this little girl in the novel, everybody thought she was ugly, thought she was hideous, thought she was terrible. And it come to find out at the end, the evil, terrible, ugly, horrible person is the preeminent site of anything like goodness. And so I think in a very real way, I am playing on those two terms and trying to, in a certain way, produce a cognitive dissonance for us. Because when we think transformation, we think Martin Luther King Jr., and I'm using him as an example here. We think of him and we think this is the person to which we should turn. And we forget that when he made his turn more to the left, he was killed. And so I think in a very real way, I'm trying to upend our normative commitments here, because I think Blackness undoes those things, and I live as an embodiment of that perpetual undoing. Is that helpful? I see you, so I get a chance.
Yeah, I decided to show my face. Yeah, and I mean, what that made me think of, another kind of cultural reference of the X-Men, right, who have mutated, and they're very powerful, and a lot of people are very afraid of them, right? But they're largely a force for good in the world. So I think about I didn't mean to interrupt, but I love the X-Men reference because I'm a Marvel fiend. But I would also say too, I think of Magneto as a kind of Malcolm X figure, right? I really do. He's a villain for a lot of folks, and people can't stand him, but it is because he, like Horton Spillers tells us, he embraces the monstrosity. You all say we're a terror, then we might be, we might actually be a terror, but there's life
in that terror. The Brotherhood of Mutants is a place where many of these mutants find solace. That's why they ride with him. That's why Mystique shows up for him, right? That's why they, and I think in many ways that's part of it, right? That even if we die, because it doesn't end well for Magneto a couple times, actually, it doesn't end well for him. It happens a lot because it doesn't end well for him, but he's saying, like, while I'm here, I've got to create this space. I've got to upend, mutate this thing. Whereas Professor X, and we notice this, Professor X tries to work with the system and they get him, and the Sentinels come for him too. Mm-hmm. That's instructive in my mind. That is incredibly instructive that you've got the guy saying, I will shake the president's hand, and they still built the Sentinels. What does that mean for us, right? Why not? If we're gonna go down, we might as well go down as the monster people say that we are, right? So hopefully that helped to unpack some things.
Yeah. So I know we're a little over, but I just have one more because it's
Sure.
a really interesting question from our colleague and friend Steve Regari. He says that you begin with a contrast between the privilege of, Heideggerian dwelling and the constant motion lived by Black bodies. What does the imperative to keep moving mean outside of the church in the street? Is it possible to achieve analogous sacred moments through protest and through performance?
I think I would say, yeah, I'm not even gonna, I'm smiling because my first book, Black Lives Matter, tries to take part of this up, actually. And so the third chapter is trying to argue, and actually the conclusion to the text is trying to argue that these moments of protest actually shouldn't be read as moments of teleological purpose, right? They shouldn't be read as, at least in my mind, they shouldn't be overlaid with trying to transform the world. That's what's happening for many of those folks. That's what's happening in terms of the discursive formations around them. But the other part about it is, and the thing that I find far more compelling than the attempt to try to change policy, is the fact that these folks decided to gather in the street to move and love and care for flesh. In the chapter, ironically enough, it's the second chapter of my text, and it's on Alton Sterling. And these are two different. I'm dealing with architecture here in the book. I'm dealing with philosophy of religion. In the book, I suggest that there was a woman named Aisha Evans who, in the wake of Alton Sterling dying, she stood in the street. And if you haven't seen the image, it's one of the most, like, it's a Pulitzer Prize winning image now. She stood in the street. And she does this. There's no telos on the backside of that. There's no purpose. There is no purposive movement, but this is a sacred act because she is revering, loving, caring for not simply Alton Sterling's flesh, but Black flesh in general. And she tells us this in an interview after things happen. And the one thing that I want to just keep emphasizing here is, as we all know, this hasn't stopped cops from killing Black folks, number one. And number two, at the end of the day, what happened when she got arrested is that they were invasive to her body when she got into jail. Her standing there as a paragon of resistance, her standing there and being lionized by many different media circles did not stem the tide of anti-Black violence, but she did it anyway. And I think that's part of what I see happening in Black church spaces. And to circle back around to your question, it is exactly what I see operative, even if it's inadvertent, it's exactly what I see operative in the streets, in the protests, in the demonstrations, in the marches. This is an attempt for Black life to be loved, for Black flesh to be revered and cared for. And I'm not convinced, I want to say this one more time, I'm not convinced that this is going to change things, because if it had, it would have. And I want to be very clear about that. George Floyd is not the first person to say, I can't breathe. We heard this 7 years ago now, and no one did anything. And New York was packed out with protests. That did not stop the tide. But what it did in those moments, and I've been part of activist organizations, what it does in those moments is it builds something like sociality. We flesh, love it hard.
Okay, well, on that note, I think we're going to end. Thank you so much. This was a really fascinating hour we spent together. Thank you. We appreciate your time and your thoughts. So this wraps up our lecture series for the semester. There is an event coming up in a couple of weeks. It's not part of the series, but I hope you'll join us for with the American Roundtable, looking at the Mahoning Valley and the industrial transformation of that part of our region. So I hope that you'll all join me in thanking Biko. It's so weird that we can't, kind of give you a round of applause, but it's Zoom for you. So thank you. We really
You're getting a lot of love in the chat though, so make
Oh,
sure you.
thank you.
lots of love in the chat. Yeah.
I super appreciate it. And I hope this was good for everybody. Again, I'm not an architect, so I don't know what I'm talking about half the time, but I think this was, hopefully this was
It was
good.
great.
It really
It was great, Biko.
Thank you.
Thank you again.
All right, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.